This must be an automated energy plant.
Energy plant? So that's energy flowing through those red pipes.
Welcome back to Vivid Noise. Now, I'm not sure if I've mentioned this before, but Sonic Heroes was my first ever 3D platformer. Until playing it, my only experience with 3D was in racing games, and the only platformers I had played were 2D Flash games. I just felt like I should get that out there before talking about this game, just so that my bias is clear. Regardless, the older I get and the more I learn about the world of 6th generation 3D platformers, the more I truly appreciate the design behind Sonic Heroes that makes it, in my opinion, one of the most solid 3D platformers of the generation. Let's get to it. First, there's the synergy between the team mechanic as a whole and the level design combined with the enemy placement. What makes these design elements work so seamlessly together is the almost invisible layer of communication happening between the game and the player whenever you need to switch characters. It's true that there's a generous amount of signs that straight up tell you who to switch to alongside these force fields which automatically change your team formation, but even when they are absent, you're still likely to instinctively know who to switch to based purely on the placement pattern of the enemies and the stage gimmicks ahead of you. Now, that might just be my 10 plus years of experience with this game taking over, but I believe that even a newcomer could start picking up on these subtle design cues just a few stages in. The enemy designs are distinct enough where you can start to relate their shape, size, and color palette to whichever character is ideal for dealing with them, and there really aren't that many character-specific stage gimmicks to memorize. In fact, aside from the super obvious stuff like homing attacking enemies, flying over pits, or breaking crates, each character type only has one situational stage gimmick. Speed types have these vertical poles, flight types have floating targets, and okay fine, power types have two, those giant fans and the gongs you hit to propel you forward. And since some of those gimmicks tend to get combined back to back during certain level set pieces, it's also fortunate that switching between characters is an absolute breeze. That sounds like something pretty trivial to bring up as praise, but you have no idea how many games that involve playing as more than one character get this wrong. You'll either have some obnoxious switching animation or arbitrary restrictions on when and where you can switch. I can think of a bunch of things that could have gone wrong here, but since they didn't, the end result is a mechanic that lends itself to some of the best game flow I've ever experienced in a multi-character platformer. Of course, you can't say switch to a flight character in freefall or anything that could break the game in that way, but for the most part, you're free to switch often and more importantly, quickly. Changing characters is so fast that even over the course of 10 years, I've yet to memorize which button scrolls through them in each direction, since I could just mash one button to choose whichever one I need practically instantaneously. Speaking of things that could have gone wrong but didn't, I've got to talk about the combat. The 6th console generation was the age of combat in platformers. Ty did it, Pac-Man did it, Rayman did it, even Crash Bandicoot did it a little bit later. And while the quality of Sonic's 3D combat has been subject to critique, especially during the 7th generation, Heroes does it so well that it took me until now to even stop and think about it. I already said that the enemy design and formations in which they spawn indirectly let you know who to switch to if you want to defeat them quickly. This goes a long way in getting you into that flow state where your fingers just move on their own and you find yourself in an elegant dance with the game mechanics. But what makes the rhythm of the gameplay that much more consistent is the level up system. By leveling your characters up, you make them more capable of dealing with almost any enemy type. So throughout the given level, there will come a point where you can just stick to one character and deal with everything that way, right? There was definitely a risk of something like that happening, which would have made the team mechanic obsolete, but fortunately, there are certain enemy types that are completely impervious to attacks from, say, speed types, so you have to switch. But even then, there was always incentive to utilize more than one character type, like with those golden turtles which you first have to flip on their backs before a power type can destroy them, and instead of Sonic's tornado move, a fully leveled up homing attack is enough to flip them as well. An all too common complaint regarding the combat in Heroes is that it kills the pacing, but evidently I disagree. Thanks to the intuitiveness and fluidity of the combat mechanics and controls, the enemy encounters become an essential part of the overall pacing. In fact, I'd say that this game's levels are more often than not better designed and more engaging than even the best of Adventure 1 and 2. And it's all thanks to what I call the ABC formula. In the adventure games, a typical Sonic or Shadow level would have one or two sections, a speedy part with little to no hazards, or a platforming section that leads back into the next speedy part. Hence, A, and B. Adventure 1, I think, did a better job blending the two together, and instead its levels feel like they were made up of the same kind of level design all the way through, but with enough variety to keep it interesting. Well then, what's the C part of Sonic Heroes' level design? Let's see. A would be the speedy parts, B would be the combat encounters, and C are the more moderately paced sections that still have enemies in them. Just like in Adventure 1, the lines between, say, B and C or C and A can get a bit blurry, and by introducing a third component of Sonic's design theory, Heroes creates levels that, while a bit on the long side, end up feeling far more substantial and satisfying to complete. You know, after concocting this method of describing level design, I think I'm starting to understand some people's dislike of anything related to the boost formula, because those games will either segregate their level sections to the point where they never mix, like colors and forces, or will blend them together so heavily that the player is unable to discern how to approach a given situation since they just don't know whether or not it's an A, B, C, etc. This is especially pronounced in HD Unleashed, hence why that game is much more dependent on level memorization than the rest. Generation strikes a similar balance to Adventure 1 in its modern stages, and Frontiers is a completely separate beast due to the duality of the open zones and cyberspace. To address another common complaint people have regarding Heroes, there's the basic movement controls. Many seem to think they are far too slippery when playing as the speed type characters, and you know, I totally get that. But that doesn't really make sense as a criticism in this context when you have two other, much more stable characters to choose from. As we've already established, switching to either one takes less than a few frames, and the game makes it very clear who you should probably have selected for a given section. If you're trying to use a speed type character during a treacherous platforming section, well, that's on you. Characters like Tails and Rouge exist with that sole purpose in mind here. They are the characters you use when you don't want to fall down a pit, just like how you pick Vector or Big when you want to kill some enemies quickly and your speed type is still level 1. Sure, if they had designed the levels like Adventure 1 and you had just speed types, every level would be a death trap. Or if they were like Adventure 2, they would have been pretty dull. But Heroes has its own levels that were designed with all three character types in mind, and that's what elevates the overall experience into a dynamic, fast-paced, and tough but fair journey. Yeah, the difficulty is another sticking point, although I'm not sure if I would truly be able to argue here since playing a game for over 10 years will obviously render some of its challenge a little faded compared to a first-time player. I'd still say that the difficulty for Team Sonic at least is perfectly fair. I could count the genuinely difficult parts on one hand, although even some of those parts can be alleviated. The alligator section in Lost Jungle, for example, is much easier if you switch to Tails and just save yourself if you miss one of the vines. That's enough counter arguments. The final thing I want to give this game credit for is its understanding of mechanical brevity. It's not a stretch to say that when Sonic Heroes came out, it was by far the most complicated Sonic game in terms of the core gameplay. You had 3 characters instead of 1, all these new enemy types, gimmicks, abilities, and a level up system. But despite all of that, Sonic Team never overstepped and made the game convoluted. After studying the various systems at play here, I believe that Sonic Heroes is one of those examples of a game that has everything it needs and nothing more. It would have been so easy for them to throw in a bunch more character upgrades, weapons, and all that stuff that 6th-gen platformers were doing, but they didn't. The level up system gives individual characters more versatility while not undermining the team aspects. And the enemy types encourage team synergy while giving you multiple options of dealing with them. The character movesets give you a great sense of control over the levels, and everything has a utility. Yes, even the Rocket Excel. The power types don't have any God of War combos or different fighting styles because that's just not necessary. Shit, rock, yeah, is all you need. I can only think of 2 or 3 abilities that would only ever be useful in multiplayer, but everything is there where it counts, and it isn't where it would have detracted from the experience. Sonic Heroes is simply an example of when ambition meets restraint, and it results in an airtight package that ballets around every possible pitfall of its respective contemporaries, and that's why, putting aside my bias, I still believe that the game is great. That's gonna do it for another episode of Vivid Noise. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.
Yes! That was tight!